So for this video we're going to be doing a code walkthrough. So the first thing that happens when the code is run is an instance of the game class is made. So we'll go through the game class. So when an instance of the game class is made, a few variables are set, and then an instance of the deck class is made as an attribute of the game. So now we'll go through the deck class. So when the deck class is made, the subroutine generate deck is called, and what this does is it goes through all the different combinations of values and suits and creates a card for each one using the card class. So when a card's created, the attributes are set to the values that have been passed into that instance, and it just means that we can look at each individual card and their different attributes and then use the different functions we have for individual cards as well. That's why they're represented through a class. Then after they've been generated, an instance has been generated, it's appended to an array, and this acts as a deck, so I can refer back to the cards at a later time. After that, the deck's created, the program will go to the setup function, which is here. So what that does is it will call the menu, the first menu. So if we run now, it will call this menu here, and it just allows the user to choose what options they want. For the starting chip count, the small blind, and the number of players. So after the menu's called, so when the menu's called, it goes to the menu subroutine, which is here, and depending on what menu stage we're in, which was this variable was set right at the start of the game instance being created, it will set different variables to different amounts. So first it will set these Boolean variables, and then it will go down here, create the screen, set some variables, and make all the buttons, which is done here. So when the buttons are made, it's done in the button menu, which can be seen at the top here, which isn't in a class, it's just so it can be used whenever it is necessary to be used. After that's done, it will go into this while loop, and for the first menu it goes into this if statement, and it's running through all the different events that happen in Pygame. So first it will be checking to see if the exit button's been pressed. So that's the X at the top right corner. If that's been pressed, the game will be exited and the program will stop. Then it checks if the mouse button's being clicked, and what that does, it then calls different subroutines for all the buttons. So I'm now going to go through the button classes so you get an understanding of what these buttons are doing. So at the top here we've got the parent class, which is general use for a button, and it can also be used as a label dependent on what functions are called within the program. So as we can see, it gets the position and the width and the height, and then if there is text, it will display text. There are these variables here, so when an instance of the button class is created, it will call this function create button. It will draw the button depending on the attributes given, and if there's text, it will display the text. After that's done, button subroutine can be called when necessary to determine whether the button is being clicked. So just in the menu section, there is the Pygame event that was if mouse button down, so that finds out when the mouse button's being clicked. So all the buttons that are on the screen that need to be activated, this subroutine will be called within that, and they'll all check whether the mouse is in the inside of the button, so dependent on the position of the mouse. So in here, you can see my mouse is inside the start button, and in here you can see it's inside the start button. So if I click it anywhere in here, it will change the value. If I click outside of here, it will not. So once it's been clicked, it will run the self.clicked function, but in the general instance there isn't anything happening, so it just passes. So another subroutine that's called in the menu is the highlighter. So what that does is it checks the mouse's position. Again, if it's within the button, it will call the highlighter function, which here just gives it a little grey highlight and then displays the text on top again. So as you see, when I hover over the buttons, they get a grey highlight to indicate that you can click these buttons. So now we have a subclass of the main parent class button, and this is increase button. It's a specific version of the button class that allows you to have a counter and increment up and down depending on the user input. And then we have a decrease button, which is the exact opposite, so we can have an increasing counter and a decreasing counter, which can be seen by these arrows here. They increase and decrease the value on the right. The start game subclass of the button still calls the initializer for the button class, just like the two subclasses above, and then it has a slightly different button function. So when it's being clicked, it will call the self.clicked, which returns false, and if it's not been clicked, it will return true. This will become more apparent what this does later on in the code walkthrough. The slider button subclass of button again calls the initializer for button, then has an additional attribute which is used throughout the whole thing. So when the mouse button down event is being checked, the button subroutine will be called, and it will check if it's in the position. So the first thing it does is if the mouse is within the button, it will call the self.clicked function, which all it does is it basically working out where the mouse is and then putting a grey dot where that mouse is. So if we run this now, we can see on the bottom right the grey dot is following my mouse. That's an instance of the slider button class. So after that's been done, it will go to the slider calculations function, which is here, and what that does is it works out the value that you as the user are trying to get. So this is dependent on the position of your mouse within the button. So as you can see, all the way at the bottom it's 8, and as I moved to the right, it will increase all the way up to 32. So this is dependent on the lower and upper limits that have been chosen by the user at the start of the game by changing the small blind. The small blind is the lower limit, and then the upper limit is double the big blind. So once that's done, it will then set the value of the slider to that, and then it will show the value to the user, which is just the number as it changes around. You can see that when I was demonstrating earlier. We'll go back to the menu and then we'll walk through what's happening here. So as you can see, all of the buttons are having their button function called, and then this start button down here is having its function called, but variables be setting dependent on what the outcome of that function is. Then after that's been determined, it will go to the highlighters and determine whether it needs to highlight any of the buttons. If it does, it will do so, just like when I hover over the start button. Then it will determine what values each of the number of players, the starting chip counter, and the small blind should be, dependent on the user inputs here. These will range from 2 to 8, 40 to 400, or 2 to 20 in respective amounts. So as you can see, it ranges from 2 all the way to 8, 40 all the way to 400, These increment for number of players, it increments in ones, starting chip count increments in tens, and small blind increments in twos. So, and then the small blind goes from 2s to 20. So as you can see, if a user input was to make it go below, it makes sure it doesn't by just setting it to the lower limit, and the same for when it goes above. So when this is done and the start button is pressed, this variable will set to true, and it will exit this bit of the code. It will skip this bit of the code because it is not the second menu yet, so it will just bypass this bit of code and go down to the bottom here, and the loop will be exited if the start button has been pressed. Then it will go to this section of code, and it will set the attributes or the values that have been chosen by the player to the values that the game needs, and then it will return these values to where it was called. So here we can see that the values get returned and they are set here, and then the small blinds worked out, the dealer position is chosen, and then the big blind and small blind are worked out from the self.blind positions function, which is just basically making the small blind the player after the dealer, and the big blind the second player after the dealer. Then it will generate a self.cards. It will generate a shared cards list using the dealed shared cards function, and it will generate a players list. So we'll go and look at those functions now. So the blind positions here, it will make the big blind 2 more than the dealer position and the small blind 1 more, and then it checks if these are too big for the number of players that the user has chosen. If so, it will correct them. So for the dealing of the shared cards, what it will do is randomly choose one of the cards out of the deck that we've already created at the start of the game instance, and then it will check if it's already a shared card or if it's already a player card. If it isn't, it won't use it. If it is, it won't use it. If it isn't, then it will use it as part of the shared cards. It will do this 5 times to get all of the shared cards. Then for the creation of the players, it will have the number of players, and it will loop through so you get the number of players required. And what it will do, it will get the players' cards, which is this function here, which is basically the same as dealing the shared cards, but it does it twice, and it checks that again these cards are not being used elsewhere. Then it will return these, and it will create an instance of the player class using the attributes given here. After the player class is an instance of the player class is created, it will be appended to an array so they can be referred back to later. I'm just going to walk through the player class now so you get an idea of what's happening there. So here, when a player class instance of the player class is created, the initializer is run, and the attributes are set dependent on what values were entered into the instance of the player class. After those have been done, some basic attributes will be set that will change throughout the game, but they start off the same for all players. Each player has a set of functions that can happen, including resetting their betting round, which is seen here, or increasing the bet this round, or altering their chip count. So this one here is just it's getting the bet that the player wants to do, checking that it doesn't go below, doesn't use all their chips. If it does use all their chips, it checks it doesn't make them go into a negative chip count. If it would make them go into a negative chip count, it reduces the bet that's possible and just bets the amount that they can bet, and then tells the computer that this player is going all in. Another important function is this display bet count. So what this is doing is it's displaying the bet amount that any player has bet this round, and this display chip count is doing the same thing for the chip count of each player. The updating chip count display is just used to update these two displays frequently so the information is fresh. I'm just going to go and show you in a 3-player game what this would look like. So here you can see the sort of displays are being set. There's the starting chip count is this one, and this one, 86, 88, and 90. To the right of them, you've got the amount that each player has bet each turn. You've got 0 for player 3, 4 for player 2, and 2 for player 1. These bets from player 1 and player 2 are just to do with the blinds, which are shown by the tokens to the left of their chip count. So once the players have been created, it will then run through the players' hands and check to see what score they've got. So basically, how good is their hand? It will do this, but it will not show any of the players these values. They're just for the computer to look at, and then it saves them having to do it later on. So here we go to this subroutine, and the first thing it does is it checks for any pairs, 3 of a kinds, 4 of a kinds, full houses, and 2 pairs. So it's just basically checking for any doubles, triples, etc. What it's doing is running through all the cards, getting the values, and getting the amount of each value of cards it has. So getting the amount of each, so it can see, each player can see 7 cards, and it's going through all 7 cards and seeing how many 2s they have, how many 3s they have, how many 4s, etc. Then at the end, it will check to see if any of these are 2, 3, or 4. If they are, it will set the hand value equivalent to the amount to either pair, 3 of a kind, or 4 of a kind. And this will come apparent what this means later on. Then it will check for flushes. It will go through and check all the cards and get a count, just like this one for pairs and 3 of a kind and 4 of a kind. It will get a count of how many of each suit there are in the 7 cards. And then at the end, if there is 5, there will be a flush. Then it will check for a straight, and it will be doing the same thing, but it will be increasing each time. So it will be checking for a 2, 3, 4, 5, for example, 6. It will be increasing by 1 each time. It's checking if a player has 5 cards of his 7 that does that. After it's checked for a straight and it is successful, it will set the value to that, either there or here, dependent on what the highest card in the straight is. Just like the flush, it'll set the value to the highest card of the flush. So if you have a flush of 2, 5, 6, 8, and 10, all of the same suit, it will make the flush as a 10. So when looking at the hands of each player, if 2 players have a flush, it will take the player's hand that has the highest value as the winner. Same for the straight. So if you have a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it will use the 6 as the identifier for how strong the straight is, and then they can be compared later on. After it's determined whether it's got a straight, it will determine if it's got a straight flush. It does this by getting a count of all the amount of suits. So it will go through and find which suit it is possible to have a flush in. Once it's determined that, it will go into that suit, and which cards have those suits, it will get the values, and if they are increasing from one value up to another by 1 each time for 5 cards, it will say that it has a straight flush. Again, just like the straight and the flush, it will be at the highest value possible. So after all that's done, it would determine the score of the player. So firstly, an array of the values of each card is made, just so if there is no hands there, it will give the highest card value to the player as their score. Then it will search to see if a straight flush is had by any player, and if there is a straight flush with an index of 0, that represents a royal flush. So that is a 10, Jack, Queen, King, Ace of the same suit. That's a royal flush, and it gives it the highest score. If it's not a royal flush, it will be the second highest score. After that, it will do a check to see if there's a 4 of a kind, then a flush, then a straight, then a 3 of a kind / full house, then pair or 2 pair. As you can see, the points are decreasing as they go. then right at the end, if the player doesn't have any hand, it will just give it the maximum value in the all cards array that we just looked at earlier. So once it's done that, it will go back to the setup menu here, and it will return all these values back to the game instance and set them as attributes. It will then determine the upper and lower limits, and it will set the second loop variable to false, which will become apparent what it does when we look at the AI player. Then it will call the self.play function. The self.play function is just calling the menu function again, but this time the menu has been changed. So it is no longer the first menu, it is the playing menu. So it will run different code within the same function. So I'm utilizing the same function for different purpose. So here it's just setting different variables here, and then it will go to this if statement, and it will set a load of variables to find the window and all the buttons that are necessary. Right at the bottom here, it's instantly getting the blinds up and decreasing the player's chip count for the amount the blinds should be decreased, and automatically betting them as they should be. So once that's done, it will go to this while loop, and then it will loop through all the events of Python. However, it won't go into the first menu, as it's not the first menu anymore. It will go down to the second menu here, and it will run this code. So once that's done, it will go through all the cards, all the players even, and their cards, and it will determine what cards they've got, and it will display those cards on the board. As can be seen like this, it will display the cards like that. So when that's done, it will then display the chip count and bet count for each player, which is the 90 and the 0 for this player. And then it will determine if the player is a dealer, big blind or small blind, and if they are, they'll be given the token corresponding to that. So here it can be seen that this player is the dealer, so they are given a dealer token, just like this player is given a big blind token and this player is given a small blind token. So once that's done, the pot is loaded, the image of the pot is loaded, which is just the stack of chips, and then the amount that the pot holds as a button is just shown below that. After that's done, it will loop through the shared cards and do exactly the same thing as the player cards and just display them here. So up until now, all cards have just been displayed face up. This section of the code is then covering up the cards that need to be covered up. So firstly, it's checking what stage we're in. So when we first create a game, it'll be the original hand, and the player won't be able to see any shared cards, just like this, and it will loop through and cover up each card with a card back, which is the red design and the white outline. Then it will move on to this section. If not end show, it will look at all the players' cards, and it will cover up the ones that should be covered up. So as you can see, the other players' cards here are covered up, but this player's card isn't. So if I was to bet 4 here and progress the player's turn, you can see the player turn moves, and it's now you can see player 1's cards, but you cannot see any other player's cards. After that's done, it will go down to this section. It will check if it is the computer player's turn. If it is, then it will run the self.computer function. If it isn't, then it will go down. I will run over the self.computer section function in a second. First, I will go over this section. So if the quit button has been pressed, just like the first menu, it will exit this game and the code. Then it will check to see if the mouse buttons are being pressed, just like the first menu, and it will call the button functions that need to be called, and it will also set a mouse down variable, which lets me determine whether the mouse is being held down and not just pressed. It will then be reset to false if the mouse button is unpressed, Then if the mouse button is being held down, the limits are determined of the game and they are passed into the button subroutine, which have been shown earlier on in this video. After this is all done, it will determine what the user wants to do. So firstly, it will determine if the user is folding. If it is, it will set that player's folding state to true, and then it will increment the player turn, which I will show you now. Here it's just incrementing the player's turn, checking that it's possible, and then looping through to check to make sure it's not a player that's folded. If it is, it will increase the player's turn again. Just go to the next player. If that person is also folded, it will keep doing this until it gets to a player that's not folded. If it ends up being the original player that this function started with, then it will set the all folded variable to true and return that to let the computer know that everyone but one player has folded. Once that's done, it will check if the all folded variable is true, and if it is, it will end the betting round and say that this player wins. So it's just the player whose turn it is will win. So if a player is checking, it will see if the check is allowed. So what it does there is if a bet that's higher than 0 has already been played, it will not allow the check. If it hasn't, it will allow the check. If the check's been allowed by this check, this making sure that the check is allowed, then it would carry out the check by saying that the player has bet this round and they're basically giving a bet of 0. And then it will call the increment in-game player turn function again that we've just gone through, and it will see if any players have all folded. If they have, then it will do the betting round finished, and this player wins. Then if a player wishes to bet, so that's done by pressing this button here, then it will determine the value the player wants to bet by the value they've selected from the slider. So you can see I've selected 2 here, and 4 here, and 3, and it varies to what I want it to be. It will check that this bet is allowed. So what it will do, it will go through all the players, find the maximum bet made this round, and it will determine if this bet is lower or higher or equal. If it is lower than the maximum bet, it will not be allowed. If the bet is equal to or higher, it will be allowed. If it's allowed, it will alter the chip count of the player making the bet, and then increase the pot by the correct amount, and then increment the turn. After that's done, or if that's done, it will then run through to see if all players have betted the same amount, or are they folded. If they betted the same amount, then it will count this, and if they folded, it will compensate and act like they have betted the same amount. If all players have betted the same amount or folded, the betting round will finish, and it will move to this section where the playing stage will be incremented to the next playing stage. So if it is the original hand, it will be incremented to the flop. If it's the flop, it will be incremented to the turn. If it's the turn, it will be incremented to the river. And if it's the river, it will be incremented to the end show. After that, the next player's turn will be set, and it will go through the players and reset their betting rounds, which we've gone through the subroutine already. After that's done, it will check if all of them are folded. If they are folded, then it will go to the end show, which is just determining the winner basically. And then it will go right back to the top here. And if it's the end show, if it's a new playing stage, it will display a different amount of shared cards. So if it's the flop, it will display 3. If it's the turn, it will display 4. And if it's the river, it will display all 5. So after that's done, if it's the end show, it will go into this section. And what that does, if the game has been ended due to the fact everyone else has folded and there's only one player left, it will run this code, and it will basically just give that player the amount of the pot and then reset the game and run a new hand. If it isn't a singular player that's won because everyone else is folded, it will go through all the players' hands, which were calculated at the start, and determine who's got the best hand. If 2 players have the same hand, so if there was a pair in the shared cards and that was the best hand that they both had and they were winning, then the pot would be split equally between them here. and then each player would get that amount. So after that's done, the round is reset using the reset round function, and then a new round is made with the new round function. We'll just run through those. So here you can see the reset round function is just resetting all the variables and buttons that are required to be reset. Then the new round function is just incrementing the dealer's position, then compensating the big blind and small blind positions in correspondence to the dealer position. Then it's creating a new, it's resetting the deck, and then creating a new shared card list, so a new set of 5 cards. Then it's resetting the player variables that need to be reset, like the folded state of the player, and then it's giving them a new hand and scoring that hand. After that's done, it will set the positions of the dealer, the big blind, and the small blind to the ones calculated at the top, and then it will do the big blind, small blinds for each player that should be big blind and small blind. They will pay straight away. So once that's done and it's the computer player's turn, it will run this section of code, and what this does is it calls the computer player function. So what that does is it calls this subroutine, and it's basically looping through all the players and then determining if they're folded, then it will not worry about them. If they're not folded, then it will look into that player and see the win probability, draw probability, or lose probability against them. And then if it's the computer player, it won't worry about it either. The computer player just puts some stars in there to indicate that it is the computer player, to keep the position of each player constant throughout. So what this does is it's calling the probability for player given cards seen. So we'll just go to that function, which is here. And what it's doing is looping through all the possibilities of cards that the player and the share cards could be. So the AI can see its own hand and any shared cards that it can see. So if there's the flop, it can see 3 shared cards. If it's the turn, it can see 4. If it's the river, it can see 5. And it will reduce that from the deck, and then it will use all the cards remaining and give them out in all the different possibilities that the player and the share cards remaining could be. And it will run through and it will score those hands. So firstly, it will get all the different combinations, and it will go through what the player's already done, their position, and it will remove the different possibilities that it wouldn't be dependent on how the player has acted already in the game, which is done here. Then it will go on to see if the player is got a better hand or not. Then it will create a dummy player here, and it will then check their hand. It will set their hand to a value that the computer determines from the random cards that it's guessing, going through all the different possibilities. So it does that, gets a value, and then it'll check it against the computer's computer score for the same shared cards and that stuff, and then it will determine whether it loses or it loses, wins, or draws against that one. And then at the end, it will get the probabilities of it winning, drawing, or losing against that player. Once that's done, it will go back to this place, and it will end up with a list of the winning probabilities, the losing probabilities, and drawing probabilities against each player. And it will determine what it should do based on those. So if the raise if the probability to win against most players is above 0.65, it will just raise. If the probability to bet is greater than the probability to fold, it will just bet. If the probability to check is greater than the probability to bet, it will check. And if the probability of it folding is equal to 0 and the probability of its betting and checking is equal to 0, it will automatically bet. Or it will fold depending on how good its hand is, rather than looking at the other player's hands. After that's done, the maximum bet is determined that it needs to bet, and then based on the counters it has got from the probabilities, it will determine whether it should raise, it should bet, it should fold, or it should check. So for it to raise, it will then bet depending on how strongly it thinks it will win from it raising. It will raise even more, so it will vary from the upper limit to the lower limit depending on how well its probability of winning is, or how well it thinks its probability of winning is. And if it decides to just bet, it will just see the maximum bet on the board. Folding, it will fold like any other player, and checking, it will check like any other player using the same limitations and everything like that. As you can see, these variables are being set, and it will run through the menu code just like any other player. So after that's done, it will return what the AI is going to do, and it will act like a normal player when it comes to the menu here. You can see it will just run through. It will just run through using these variables to determine whether it wants to bet, fold, or check. So that's the code walkthrough done. Hope you enjoyed.